The following tutorial will be day 1, step 1 implementation for the game called Dots. We will be creating 4 base classes, Dots Game, which will be our default game class, DPawn, which will be our default pawn class, DPlayer Controller will be our default player controller class, and DPlayer Input, which will be our default player input class. The D actually stands for dots in this, not default. But you can pretty much call these whatever you want, just as long as the name for your classes matches the name of your file. Now the files you'll be creating will be inside of your UT version and go inside of development and into source. Once inside of source, you will have a folder called MyMod. You will want to change that to dots. Once that's done, go inside of dots and then go inside of classes. We have 4 classes set up here, just like I called out before. We have dotsgame.uc, dpawn.uc, dplayercontroller.uc, and dplayerinput.uc. All of these end with the extension .uc because that is the Unreal Script extension. If you change this to anything else, the front end will not actually compile these because it will not read them as Unreal Script. So we will start off by going into dotsgame, and we will create class dotsgame extends game info. As I mentioned before, the class name has to match the file name. So dotsgame class will actually match dotsgame.uc. If you want to name this something else, you're more than welcome to, but you will need to change, of course, the different defaults that we put in for the default properties. For instance, default pawn class equals pawn, class dpawn. If you were to change this to epawn, you of course would want to make this epawn here, make dpawn or class dpawn epawn, and of course make the class file name, instead of dpawn, it would have to be epawn. So there's a couple things you'd have to change if you don't use these names. Back to dotsgame. So we will create the default pawn class, which is the physical representation of these characters, whether it's the bots or whether it's the player himself. Then we will set a default player controller class, which will be dots.dplayercontroller, and that's encompassed by 2 apostrophes. The dots is going to be the file name that we're storing all this in, basically what you just changed MyMod to. And then finally, b delayed start equals false, which will allow the game to run as soon as we start it. Otherwise, we might be stuck in spectator mode. So we will go into the dpawn now and create a dpawn class. Class dpawn will extend gamepawn, and we can go ahead and put the default properties, but we really have nothing inside of it just yet. When we get to step 2, we will be adding things into this. And then we'll make dplayer controller, and this will extend game player controller class. And inside of here, we were going to add 1 default property, which will set the default player input, and that will be input class equals class apostrophe dots dot dplayer input and apostrophe. And then we'll make a dplayer input, and we'll call that class dplayer input extends game player input, and we'll make that within dplayer controller. This does is it allows dplayer input to exist within dplayer controller during compile time. Now once those are all finished, we need to make a few changes to the config files. So what we will do is we need to go back into our folder, and we need to backtrack to our version folder. I changed my version folder to dots, not to confuse anybody, but just so that I know where exactly I am. So we go from dots, or in your case it might say UDK, and then the type or the version of the UDK you have. And we go into UT game and then into config. Inside config, you'll have numerous default INIs, and you'll have UT game INIs. Now the UT will actually be created by the default, so you don't need to so much change these as much as you need to change the default and then delete the UTs. So we'll go into default game.ini first, and actually before we go into this, one thing I would suggest, if you haven't already, is to select all of these files, right click, go to properties, and remove the read only. If you don't do this, they're going to yell at you when we try to save over it. So we'll go into the default game.ini, and we will change default game and default server game to dots.dotsgame. And with dots, of course, like I mentioned before, is the file we created that keeps our classes, and dotsgame is the default class that we created moments ago. And then we'll go into player controller class, and we'll equal dots.dplayercontroller. Go ahead and save that and close out. Then we will go back into the default engine.ini, and we'll add 1 line underneath Unreal Ed.editor engine. We'll add plus edit packages equals dots. This will allow front end to know that our package actually exists and to go ahead and compile it at compile time. So we'll go ahead and close out of this, and now we can delete UTGame and UTEngine.ini. Once those two are deleted, we can close out and go into UT front end. And on the right side of make, you want to click and you can click full recompile. This will recreate your INIs and recompile everything together. You don't need to do this every time, but it's always a good thing to do if you change the default INIs, just to make sure everything mixes in right. And after that is finished, we then can go ahead and create our shortcut to our game. Now, if you were to use the UT front end launch, you will actually not get your game because we haven't made any changes to front end yet. So we need to make our own special shortcut to our game. So we right click on our desktop and we will go to New and then Shortcut. Our target address will be where your udk.exe is located, and this should be in your UDK file, then in your version file, then in binaries, and then it will be called udk.exe. Once you have that in, you can go ahead and you can then do a space, and we'll need to do test map. Now, you don't have to do test map. You can actually do whatever you want for your map, but in this case, for this tutorial, we're going to use test map. And then we will do a question mark, game equals, and then dots game, space, dash log. The dash log is going to allow a log to be created that we can view as the game is running. If we didn't do this, we would have to go and look for an actual written log that gets created each time as well. But it sometimes doesn't show us all the information we need, so it's always nice to have this log running. So we will go ahead and hit OK once that's finished, and we go inside, and once that starts running, the scripts will, it might prompt you, but if you made it and did a full recompile, it probably won't prompt you like it did for me. And once that begins to run, you'll get the log that shows up, and it'll run through. And at this point, errors will show up if it crashes, and it'll give you an idea of why it crashed. And then the game will load up, and once inside the game, you're pretty much going to see my little test map. It's just some green texture or material that I threw on. You won't actually see a character or anything like that at this point. This is just a real basic level. And that is the end of the first tutorial.